Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSC Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
Half of our waking experience, we are actually not paying attention to the thing we intend to do.
That's Amishi Jha, psychologist and author of the national bestseller Peak Mind. Her research centers around an important question that many of us can all too easily overlook.
What do we need to do to keep our brains fit?
Today, what her research shows about how to master our attention in such a way that contributes to emotional health and a flourishing life.
These are things we can do privately every day for a short period of time. Our research suggests as little as 12 minutes a day, and profoundly change the way we feel and our capacity to act effectively in the world.
All coming right up. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. Imagine a beautiful, temperate, sunny weekend day at the park. You're lying in the grass, all green, surrounded by trees gently swaying in the breeze. Kids are playing a game not far away, giggling with delight. Within your sight is a stand of hydrangeas in their full summer glory. And in the distance, there's the crack of a baseball bat hitting a ball, the watching crowd cheering. But all of this is happening all around you without you even noticing. Maybe you're mindlessly replaying yesterday's argument at work, or remembering some pain from a decade prior, or ruminating on the latest political outrage. Whatever the particular, you're completely oblivious to the beauty around you. We've covered the topic of attention before with conversations with poets, peacemakers, and Buddhist meditation teachers, but today we pay attention to the research of neuroscientist Amishi Jha. She invites us to think differently about our attention, namely that our tendency to let our attention wander may be an evolutionarily designed trait that has great utility, and that if we learn to train our capacity to focus our attention, it may turn out to be something akin to a very human superpower. Enjoy. Amishi Jha is Director of Contemplative Neuroscience and Professor of Psychology at the University of Miami. She received her PhD in Cognitive Neuroscience from the University of California, Davis. Her work has been featured at TED, NATO, the World Economic Forum, the Pentagon, and the UK Parliament. Today, we're discussing her national bestseller, Peak Mind, which explores her research on how attention can be trained for optimal performance and well-being. Welcome, Amishi.
Great to be here.
It's a delight to have you with us. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation and hearing all that you have to teach us. You start out with a very provocative assertion in your book saying that we kind of miss 50% of our lives. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a wake-up call when you hear that for the first time. But essentially what I'm saying is that half of our waking experience, we are actually not paying attention to the thing we intend to do. So we are lost in thought, we are in the future, we're in the past, but we're not actually experiencing it. And because the brain is a metabolic energy hog, we think that this is not happening by accident. There's actually some utility to it. But unfortunately, it also makes us realize that maybe we want to try to be there for more of the minutes of our lives.
Yeah, so you set this up in a very closing passage of your book. You say, the battle for your attention is the battle for the resources to live your life. Very strong assertion about the importance of that. So tell us more about how you see the significance of beginning to pay attention to our attention.
Maybe it's even a good idea to back up of why we even have this thing called attention in the first place. You might not need to have an attention system. Why did the human brain even evolve or adapt to have this thing? And it seems to be tied to this challenge that the brain faces computationally, that there's far more out there in the environment than it can fully process. So there has to be some way to get information regarding everything that's available in some orderly manner so you can behave and act on what you need to act on. Attention is a solution to that problem. What we know of attention is that its job seems to be to restrict or limit information so that it's a subset from all that's available. But we use the full computational resources of the brain to analyze that subset, and then we can go to the next piece of information, analyze it, and so on. And that way, by subsampling the world, we can start building a complete representation of what's going on. And that subsampling is not for no reason. It's so that we can actually behave in a goal-directed way to serve us in our survival, and in this day and age beyond survival, really to thrive and benefit and live meaningful lives.
What would you say are kind of some key culprits in our attention getting hijacked or not being located in some sort of place that's useful or helpful to us?
Sometimes I'll refer to these things as kryptonite for attention because they really just cause it to fail. And we know this from studies we've done in my lab where we'll bring people in, have them do attentionally demanding tasks, and then we introduce some of these features of kryptonite that I'll tell you about. And then sure enough, people will fail. And then we can extrapolate how those kinds of circumstances are not simply available to us in these contrived laboratory environments, but are part and parcel of what it means to be alive. So the top three that we've repeatedly see having a negative impact on attention are stress, meaning this perceived feeling of overwhelm that I can't fully meet the challenges that are before me. Threat, and that could mean not only threat to your own physical safety, but even your psychological sense of threat, so social evaluative threat. And then poor mood or negative mood. And when we experience those, it is very, very likely that we will suffer in terms of our attention being able to be devoted to the other things we want to do. And typically what will happen is it'll turn inward toward continuing to kind of feed on the sources that are related to stress, threat, and poor mood.
You say in this early part of the book that a lot of times what we describe as not paying attention is actually our attention doing what our attention does, but it's just not focused in a particular way.
This is really, really a very important thing to keep in mind, because oftentimes we'll say, oh, I was just on Instagram for 5 hours. I didn't mean to be, or TikTok, or whatever your particular thing might be. And I wasn't paying attention. Well, what you're actually saying is I was not devoting my attentional resources to the thing I wanted to be doing, right? So let's call that the goal-directed task. So you had an intended placement for where you wanted your attention to go, and instead it went somewhere else. It could be on your phone, and oftentimes, even if we have no technology involved, it'll go internally to things that are not related to the task at hand. And this is where I was saying these sources of stress, threat, and poor mood can be entirely internally generated, and then essentially capture your attention and hijack it so that it keeps it focused on that content rather than the thing you want to devote it to.
Tell us more then about the way evolutionary science can help us make sense of some of the things our brain does that feel so frustrating to us.
So, for example, long, long ago, our ancestors are at a watering hole, focused on ensuring that they get their thirst quenched, and they're focused on just that. If you become hyper-focused on that, and you don't wander away from that, it's very likely you won't notice something rustling in the leaves near you that says, I should get away from here, I could be prey. You don't want it to be locked in so hard that it can't notice. If we think about the evolution of the brain and the development of the frontal lobes allowed us to actually not even be tethered to our moment-to-moment experience so that we could create entire worlds within our own mind. And so now we can be distracted not just by other things in the environment, but things that we've generated internally. A thought, right? And so it seems to be that the evolutionary advantage is that we can also do wonderful things with that capacity. We can problem solve. We can perspective take. We can imagine other scenarios playing out. We can plan for the future, reflect on the past. So it's both an advantage and a cost in that sense.
Yeah. I just find that sort of approach so fascinating and so helpful because I think that as a recovering perfectionist, I can get so exasperated by the fact that I can't just simply stay focused on something and my mind takes off here or there, or I might get lost in some sort of simulation that you're talking about. But simply the observation that, oh no, these are great gifts to us that have made possible survival at given points, as well as the capacity to create and develop all sorts of beautiful, wonderful things. And simply putting that sort of frame on it, I think is a much more helpful way than what I sometimes tend to do of kind of beat myself up about this.
Well, yeah, I think that's really important to understand that these are gifts in some sense, and we want to use these gifts with our awareness, which often is what gets us into trouble is we have no idea that we're lost in thought until somebody pulls us away. But the other thing is that when we understand that this is the nature of the mind, there'll be no expectation that you're going to be laser focused in some continuous manner. Just disabuse yourself of that. And so what we know now from a giant, meta-analyses that we've done is that essentially every minute that you spend on a sustained attention task, your chances of mind wandering increase. So that by 20 minutes in, you're likely to be gone about half the time. So probabilistically, this is just like a clock is running. And knowing this can wake you up to your increasing vulnerability to distraction, but also not make you feel so bad when it happens and have the goal be to simply get back on track. Because the noticing that we are wandering, it's the insight moment that says, oh, I can do something differently now.
Yeah. 20 minutes, which I suppose those of us who teach undergrads and grad students, it's like we do know this, right? You start getting much past 20 minutes in a lecture and you really have to work to keep people's attention.
Well, right. And you have to remind them of their own intrinsic motivation. You have to acknowledge that there could be fatigue setting in. And all these are perfectly healthy and useful ways to re-engage the system. But sort of without any prodding or prompting or support, it's very likely there's going to be a drift. And, sure, we can, as professors, both of us can probably share stories about distraction in the classroom. But I think about all the other professions in which after 20 minutes, having significant lapses could really mean life or death consequences, right? So think about a surgeon 20 minutes into surgery, or a pilot, or any kind of military service member like the folks that we work with, or first responders. These are incredibly important contexts in which you want to make sure that you are aware of where your mind is and noticing when it might have a tendency to wander away, and then train it, in my view, to get it back on track efficiently and without delay.
I hear you poking some at the grave contemporary concern about technology as being the primary cause of evaporation of capacity of paying attention, or the increased reality of distraction. And I hear you saying, well, maybe we need to see this as a much more perennial problem that just takes a particular contemporary shape. But do you want to comment on that some?
I would 100% agree with that summary of the way that I conceptualize it. Distractibility is not a modern problem. It's exacerbated by modern contexts. Distractibility is a human problem. And there are so many, in my mind, heartwarming stories of people like medieval monks that are in the middle of their monastery, devoting their life to a life of contemplation. They left all their worldly possessions, and they really started thinking about distraction as a type of demon, and did whatever they could to try to figure out how to banish this demon, and found it quite difficult, right? So, and I'm talking now specifically about monasteries in the West. I think the Eastern monasteries also suffered from this, had other strategies that they implemented. And part of that was to directly tackle that problem of distraction by actually training the mind to notice it in some sense. And this is before there was any hint of Facebook or TikTok or any of that, right? And if they suffered from that without any external sources of distraction, or at least the capacity to minimize those as much as possible, there's really, in some sense, no hope for us, because even with our extremely well-intentioned intent to stay focused on the task at hand, something as small as a ding on your phone can derail the whole enterprise. And that, too, is, by the way, not a problem with our brain. Our brain is behaving appropriately by noticing the ding. Nonetheless, we will suffer by not being able to sustain focus when we are pulled away in that way.
Yeah, you suggest that the fact that we can be distracted, in this case by the ding, is indicating that our attention is acting according to design, and all the people who are designing the technology know how our attention works, and they're leveraging that to grab our attention. Is that right?
Absolutely. Right. That's what we mean when we talk about this attention economy, is that the interfaces, the social structure, the self-relevance, the novelty, all of these features of social media platforms are precisely not only tuned to maximize capturing our attention and holding it, but personalized so that it's not just anyone. It's Amishi's interests. Amishi's getting the likes. Amishi's getting the thumbs up. Whatever it is coming to me directly. And that is a very, very difficult thing to try to overcome by sheer will.
Yeah. So before we start talking about some solutions here, you describe attention as a superpower, which is obviously a very aspirational kind of way you're hoping your readers will frame the seriousness or the potential of taking these practices that you're just going to prescribe seriously. But make a case for us that our attention is a superpower.
Well, it's a superpower in the sense that it fuels almost every single thing that we do. And I'll just name 3 things that it helps us do, right? So our ability to think. So what does it actually mean to think? Essentially, some mental content arises as a thought, and you can think that you're willing that, but it arises, and we are going to be conscious of the arising of it. Then another piece of mental content arises as another thought, and another thought, and another thought. And the way in which we can have coherence in our thought is by paying attention, meaning the hyperlinks between these arising thoughts really determine how coherent and rational thinking will be. And what allows for that connection to be sensible and relevant is this capacity for attentional selection, or sometimes I'll refer to it as sort of the flashlight of attention, so that it's laser pointed, it's narrow, it's constricted and direct. So just the ability to think requires this capacity to narrow and focus our attention. Another way to think about its relevance and why it's a superpower is that it's used for things like our ability to connect with other people. So in some sense, interaction, collaboration, care, all of these are part of the purview of attention. To feel care from someone else, typically it's that they're paying attention to you. Same thing with extending care. And when we talk about that flashlight, it's like we're directing it toward another person now. They are the focus of what is most prominent in our mind in that moment. Thinking, connecting, and then feeling, our emotional life, the experience of emotion, as well as the regulation of emotion. So, I always think about this every time now, in particular, after I've been practicing these mindfulness practices for quite some time. Think about having the most delicious dessert you've ever had in your life, right? It's before you, the richness and the deliciousness of it. Now you're completely distracted in that moment. Something has really pulled your mind away. Will you experience that joy of the dessert, even as it's in your mouth? Probably not. So attention allows us to fully experience emotion. Now that has the good side of joy, but also the other side when it's not going to be so joyous, but we're there for it. As well as when I said regulation of emotion, ensuring that the experience and expression of emotion is proportionate to what is acceptable and appropriate, right? So somebody spills a cup of coffee and you might get a little annoyed, like, oh, you spilled my cup of coffee. You probably shouldn't run up and down the street screaming at the top of your lungs, a little bit of an overreaction. So ensuring that the way we are communicating internally to ourselves of the experience and to others in terms of the expression needs to make sense and be context appropriate, which attention allows us to do. And most people do not think of mood as something tied to attention. That's a new one for most people, but the data is now clear that essentially depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a number of other psychological disorders are fundamentally tied to our attentional capacity. And those that are able to have more access to the fully powered capacity of their own attention system are more likely to be functional in the presence of psychological disorders, as well as overcome their negative impact on their lives.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Amishi Jha. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your favorite podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be most appreciative if you'd go to your favorite podcast app and write up a glowing 5-star review of No Small Endeavor, because those reviews help extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, how we might start to build the capacity to focus our attention through mindfulness, and why mindfulness practices might best be understood as brain exercise. So let's talk then about the solution. You're suggesting that one fundamental solution to regaining some sort of sense of greater control over attention is mindfulness meditation?
That's right. For me, I'm an Indian woman. I certainly grew up with a notion of meditation as something people do. It was part of the cultural landscape that I come from. But frankly, as sort of a hard-charging neuroscientist, I thought it was not so much for me. And never did I think that it would be something that we'd spend my lab's resources and time studying. Or did I think that out of all the solutions that we would try to strengthen attention, it would be the only one that consistently was found to be beneficial to strengthen attention, and others are not. So I just kind of want to say that if any of the people listening to our voices are skeptical with regard to meditation or mindfulness, I fully can appreciate that. I was there myself. And I think the journey for me overcoming my skepticism is also important to point out, which is attention is obviously, as we already talked about, very important and, as we mentioned, vulnerable. But there's not an obvious path on how to train it and strengthen it. And people have been trying for a very long time on how to do that, at least for the last, let's say 40, 50 years with modern cognitive neuroscience. And most of the approaches involve training it with some kind of repetition of attentionally demanding tasks. So you come in front of a computer screen, you do things that require attention, and the notion was that if you do that enough, you'll have stronger attention. It doesn't seem to be the case. What people get really good at after doing this long-term training is the task. But now if you give them a slightly different task, they're no better than if they'd never been trained at all. So it's this problem of generalizability that attention training solutions have really failed on. And that's where we're seeing the biggest benefit with mindfulness. I just want to mention, it's not obvious that this should be the case. But in what we've talked about already, we need solutions to refuel ourselves. Training does seem to make a lot of sense. It's just how to train that's been a puzzle. And now we could talk a little bit about what it means to even train in mindfulness. But I would love it if you maybe just to set the stage on that, like how has it helped you?
I think I first just started kind of wandering into it, and I've dealt with anxiety a fair amount, and I've dealt with depression. I don't remember why I started doing this, but years ago, we have a large backyard, and I decided that I was going to walk twice around backyard and front yard in the mornings. And my goal was to not think about anything and simply to be present to whatever came in front of my eyes or to my ears, as a way of simply to be present. And I started realizing that this simple exercise gave me a greater capacity to be calm and to regulate my own emotions and regulate my own thinking. And then I started reading more about mindfulness meditation and have practiced it a fair amount through the years. And I really think that it has profoundly kind of rewired me. I don't know if that's, I don't know if that's correct neuroscience lingo, but I feel like it's rewired me in a way that I simply can navigate challenging contexts in a way that I couldn't 10, 12 years ago. And I'm just super thankful for the practice and find it wonderful.
Oh, that's really nice to hear. I'm so happy you landed on that, kind of asking that of yourself. And it certainly fits within the family of practices that are offered in mindfulness training programs. So the main thing to say about mindfulness, maybe just defining what we even mean by the term. So mindfulness is a mental mode. It's a way of making the mind, intrinsic to all of us. I can't create mindfulness in someone. You already have it. But it's a very specific kind of mode. It has to do with present-centered attention that is essentially without emotional reactivity or conceptualization. Right? So, and I love the way that you put it. You were in the here and the now with the practice even that you described. You're in the here and the now without a story about it and without the thinking overtaking your experience, but having a direct present moment experience. So the key features, as I already said, is present moment attention. and doing this in this sort of receptive or observational way. So the family of practices with mindfulness training are aiming to cultivate both of those things, better attention and better sort of, let's call it better focused attention and better receptive attention. And the notion is that if you practice these things over and over again, the intrinsic appearance of mindful moments will increase in your moment-to-moment lives. And the formal way to do this is to take time out of your regular life to do a dedicated practice. Usually we want to do something that we might call stillness practice. I mean, the walking meditation that you actually described is another way to do it, but stillness in the sense that there's no other intended goal, and oftentimes it's literally being still, not moving. And so one category is what we call focused attention practices. Those are practices in which we pick an anchor for our attention, something as simple as the sensations of breathing in this moment. And I would say people should get as granular as possible of where they're going to put their attentional focus. And this flashlight metaphor is helpful. So I call it the find your flashlight practice. Set the intention to put your flashlight on a particular sensory experience. So coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils. It could be the feel of your feet on the ground. It could be any number of things, whatever the anchor is for you. It could be a word, it could be a thought. But I would avoid the thought because it can tend to get proliferated, but a concept, let's say, a singular focus. And that is going to be the goal for the formal practice. Keep the mind on that anchor. The second instruction of the focused attention practice is notice where the mind is moment by moment. And when you notice that the mind has wandered away from that anchoring object, return it back. So it's focusing, pointing that flashlight, noticing where the flashlight is, and then redirecting it back. And this is what I will often refer to as my military colleagues do, the mental push-up of mindfulness in 3 simple steps. And then we repeat over and over again. And we're, of course, not doing this for the purposes of just being Olympic-level breath followers. I mean, who cares if you feel the sensations of the breath? But it's that when you cultivate the capacity to steady your mind and point your attention willfully to where you want it to be, notice where the mind is moment by moment to see if you're on track or not, and then willfully get your attention back on track, that is a strengthening of a system that can be very useful no matter what you're doing, having a conversation with somebody or in a meeting or whatever it is.
Yeah, I love that, the way you described that. I think one of the things I had to kind of get through or get over or let go of was it helped me when I did not think of meditation as, I'll put this in scare quotes, a spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. And I began to think of it precisely as you said. The way I would say it and the way I have to say it to my students is it's like doing like bicep curls for my brain is what I tell them, right? Is that this is simply a mental exercise. It's a workout for the brain. Don't think of it in some sort of woo-woo or spiritual sense as much as it is, and I think there are helpful ways we can think of it in a spiritual sense. But for me, I had to get over some of the baggage that came with that and just said, what am I doing here? I'm trying to help my brain get better at facilitating my own flourishing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is what it's doing, yeah.
I appreciate you saying that. And frankly, as I said at the outset in my disclosure of being a real skeptic of all of these types of meditation as sort of an umbrella topic, it was that. It was this notion that I would have to buy into an entire belief and cultural system that I may or may not espouse in my life. And then realizing that there are aspects that certainly will benefit from a particular cultural container, but there are other ways in which no particular belief system is required to benefit. That was a really interesting kind of insight, because it also means that you can open it up to offering it to people regardless of what their particular worldview or belief system may be. In the same way, you can have physical exercise that's available to people, right? I mean, there's no particular belief system that's involved in going for a run, in some sense. So I just think that understanding, and by the way, it's not just that you're thinking that it's brain training, it actually is brain training. And now we know this from not just a study or two, but meta-analyses, even meta-analyses of meta-analyses in terms of the number of studies that are proliferating, that are actually formally finding that the brain networks tied to attention and of mind wandering are kind of recalibrated with this type of a practice. The way, we think about how attention works in the brain is that there's an entire network of brain regions that sort of hum together, work together to produce this experience of attentional focus. And those nodes are communicating with greater efficiency when we practice, and they're being less hijacked from internally generated distractibility and mind wandering.
I'm not positive where I got this phrase from. I think it may have been from a book by Kelly McGonigal at Stanford, but I think she's the one that has a line where she says, bad meditation is good meditation. And what I take from it, she means by that is that if I'm doing mindfulness meditation, for me, often typically focusing on my breath, as you said, sensation of the breath at the tip of my nose, and then I note that my mind has wandered. The temptation for me is to think, oh, I caught my mind wandering and now bring it back. And what I hear her saying is, no, the fact that I notice my mind has wandered and gently bring it back to my anchor, that's the gold. It's that's kind of like the good stuff. So rather than, again, beating myself up about the fact that my mind has wandered, it's the fact that I notice it and bring it back. That's the bicep curl. Would that resonate with what you're saying?
100%. And I would say even get rid of the framing of good and bad. In some sense, because like we said, 50% of our waking moments, when we're just living our regular lives, we're going to have our mind wander away. It is the nature of the mind. It is part of the hardware and software in our operating systems that makes our brain this way. There is not only nothing wrong with your mind wandering, but it's just going to happen. The instruction is not focus on an anchor. And if you happen to be one of those losers whose mind wanders, bring it back. It's when you notice your mind has wandered, because it will happen. That is, like you said, a golden moment, because it's like, you woke up in the middle of the fog of your own distractibility to now do something about changing the situation. And that just means bringing your attention back.
You discussed the way in which research on positivity doesn't achieve what a lot of folks think it does. Would you talk about that?
Sure. I want to just frame this, that having positive emotion, a good thing. Who doesn't want to have positive emotion? Aiming to cultivate the good in your life, a very good thing. Things like gratitude journaling, appreciating those around you. All of these are wonderful things that I'm not saying we should discount. The specific aspect of what we've done tied to positivity training is for people that are in the middle of high stress, high demand circumstances. And one of the key studies we did was in active duty service members that were about to be deployed to a war zone. This was over a decade ago now. And the question I had was, what would be the utility of positive psychology as a way to help people in the middle of those kinds of intensive circumstances? Because frankly, that is the solution that is still to this day being implemented by the U.S. Army under some of their programs. And, the research that led to that, again, I see it as wonderful research. Most of that was not done in high stress, high demand circumstances where people were actually in the middle of about to endure the fight, so to speak. So the thing about positive emotion is that to cultivate it, to hold it, to notice things that are positive in your life and to act in ways that promote that is energy intensive. It'll take attentional resources. So, for example, if in this moment you're neutral and you want to experience more positive emotion, you might come up with a positive memory. And then you might bask using your attention in the emotion that's generated by that memory. That required attention to retrieve the memory and attention to keep that emotion being experienced, right? So my concern was that when attentional resources are scarce, because under demanding circumstances, we know that you'll have less and less attention. We already talked about over the course of 20 minutes, you might have less attention. So over the course of multiple weeks of demanding circumstances like pre-deployment training, or even for us university types, the academic semester, we know that undergrads, for example, have poorer attention at the end of the semester versus the beginning of the semester. So under those circumstances, if you provide a solution that says cultivate positive emotion, I was concerned that you're trying to make them use up resources that are scarce. And so in our study, what we did is we compared offering mindfulness training, which is not aiming to produce any kind of particular emotional state, but instead have present-centered awareness that is more free of conceptual thought. We compared mindfulness training to positivity training with a trainer that had expertise in both, matched for the amount of time, etc. We wanted to track how attention looked. And it ended up, the group that doesn't get any kind of training, over the course of, let's say, 8 weeks of pre-deployment training, attention is worse at the end than the beginning, just like the students over the academic semester. When we look at people that get mindfulness training, and we found this in this study and many other studies, they're actually stable over time. So even though their colleagues who don't get the training will decline in their attention, they will not show any decline. They'll just show stability. They're the same as they were at the outset. That may not seem like a big deal. Most people don't do giant intervention studies to see no change, but relative to what we saw when we didn't give it, it was a really good thing. So the question is, what was positivity going to look like? And I was going to be happy if it did something even better. Great. Now we have an even better solution to offer. Unfortunately, what we found was that, like the no training group, there was a significant decline in attention with the positivity group, and it was actually slightly worse than getting nothing at all. And that to me was important to recognize, is that though cultivating positive emotion can be a very good thing, be cautious about when you choose this as the go-to solution to help you. And if you're under a high demand interval of stress in your life, it may not be the appropriate thing to try to help yourself not only generate better attention, but even better mood.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, why 12 minutes a day might be all it takes, and the practical methods for getting there. Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Another metaphor I have found helpful, and I don't remember where I got this one from, and it resonates with me because my undergrad degree was computer science, but this guy talks about if we use the metaphor of kind of like super users in a computer where they can look and see all the different processes that are running in a computer where a normal user might not be able to see what all's going on, that we kind of have this capacity with our own mind. That is, we can observe ourselves thinking and observe ourselves thinking. And that if we will take seriously the capacity we have to observe ourselves thinking, that itself can help break us from the tyranny of rumination. If I have some sort of rumination start happening, I can step back from that and observe that rumination and say, oh, okay, that process is taking a lot of my CPU energy today. And then I can say, well, do I want to continue to give a lot of energy to that? I can if I choose. Or there are some other things over here that I could spend some time thinking about that might be a little better use of my time. So do I want to choose one of those to do that? And I have found that helpful, but I don't know, any commentary or thoughts on that metaphor?
Yeah, I love it. I love the computer science approach to thinking about this. So the function you're talking about is oftentimes called decentering or even psychological distancing. We talked about the focused attention practices, right? But there's another whole family of practices called open monitoring practices, which really help us cultivate this capacity. And I have a practice in my book called River of Thought. You first do these focused attention practices to learn how to sort of steady your mind. But now after you've done those for a while, you can move on to the River of Thought practice. Imagine yourself sitting on a giant boulder at the edge of a riverbank. All of the mental content that arises is like the flowing of the river. You are at this distance, allowing yourself to observe what is coming up and what is dissipating without holding on to any of it. It's that distancing of yourself from the actual immersion in the content that can provide so much freedom in some sense, choice in what you do next. Sometimes you can do this watching in the early stages by noting what it is. You could say, thought, sensation, memory. You can give it a label to help you sort of touch in and let go. And then at some point, you might not even need to do that at all. You would be not following the instruction if you did end up choosing a particular focus for your attention. So if you had some thought and then you grabbed onto it, now you're no longer doing the practice. So the way of waking up in that practice is, I can just step back again. I can take my seat on that boulder and just watch the river again. I'm so happy to hear you talking about the value of these specific practices. And I think that's the bigger hope in all of this, is that these are things we can do privately every day for a short period of time. Our research suggests as little as 12 minutes a day, and profoundly change the way we feel and our capacity to act effectively in the world. And I think that makes me very, very hopeful.
Right. You say that your research shows that 12 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks can make a profound difference in your life.
As a scientist, I know this. Anytime you give a specific prescription, somebody's going to come along and say, no, it's actually 11.5 minutes. So I just like to say the intention for giving any kind of number is to figure out the ballpark we're talking about, right? So if it's more like, if I came to you and said, we've done research and it's like, you need about 6 hours a day for 6 months, and that's all you can pretty much be doing, most of us would be like, yeah, forget it. So part of this was like, what is the ballpark of the minimum effective dose to start seeing tractable changes in the way at least attention operates? And so what we found is that essentially the more people practice, the more they benefit. But the minimum effective dose to protect attention, especially for those in high stress professions, is about 12 minutes a day, 3 or more days a week. But the more you do, the more you benefit. So you want to shoot for getting the bare minimum threshold and then advantage yourself by doing more and more. And so now in most of our programs, we'll shoot for 12 to 15 minutes that we ask people to do about 5 days a week. Because if you say 5 days, people might get to it 3 or 4 days a week. And it helps to set a more reasonable standard of what might be achievable for busy people.
Well, that's another way in which I think the comparison to physical exercise is helpful in that we've learned socially the indispensable importance of exercising physically, but you're helping us see the indispensable nature of exercising mentally. And when you think about 12 minutes a day versus 30 to 60 or 90 minutes a day of doing physical exercise, that becomes much more feasible, I think.
Yeah, and I think I just want to make a plug for all of us scientists because we don't have the cultural understanding that physical exercise is necessary for physical health out of thin air. I mean, like literally 150 years ago, if you saw somebody running down the street, you'd think they were being chased by a bear or like running from a fire, right? This was not a normal activity, but it is now. And the reason that I believe that it is because there has been so much research that has connected the dots between physical exercise and physical health so that now our public health officials can give us a prescription that we can trust. Oh, okay, if I do this much, and I should try to meet this minimum. It's not go for a walk whenever you want. It's do cardiovascularly intensive exercise 30 minutes at a time, 150 minutes a week. That's the prescription. Now, we might not all get there, but we know what the prescription is. Part of my interest and part of the contribution of what scientists like me are trying to do is find out what the answer is with regard to the mind, just as you said. What do we need to do to keep our brains fit? And in particular, for me, it's how do I keep my attention fit in the modern attention economy with the stresses and, slings and arrow that life will bring? And how do I still take hold and keep hold of my mind in the middle of difficult circumstances? So that is the aspiration of this enterprise, is to give evidence-based guidance on what people can do for their mind every day to advantage their well-being.
Do I understand correctly, you were born where Gandhi's ashram was located?
Yeah.
If at all, how do you imagine that kind of legacy might be at work in your own life or your vocation or in your psyche?
Right. No, I appreciate the question. So yeah, I was born in Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat in India. And that is where Gandhi's ashram is. And that's where he did a lot of the work that he did in his life, especially as it had to do with freeing India from British rule in a nonviolent manner. So, I would say that the broader enterprise of engaging in certain practices to result in positive outcomes in the world is part of sort of the larger cultural landscape of the place that I come from. But the part that I really think about when it comes to Gandhi in particular is this notion, he's known for ahimsa, right? And people will say that that's a nonviolent approach to problem solving. And the thing that I always remember is that ahimsa does not mean inaction. It actually could mean tremendous action in the service of not having a violent outcome. And so part of the most fundamental way we can think about cultivating a mind that is capable of thinking better, connecting better, and feeling better is to ensure that the violence that we might bring upon ourselves and other people is limited, as minimized as possible, by ensuring that we're fully there to experience our lives and have right action in some sense in support of the life we want to lead. So I find it to be very much tied to sort of the inspiration for what I want to help people do. Yeah.
Fascinating. I think that you've alluded to this already, but playing off what you just said about Gandhi and ahimsa, We really can tend to do a lot of violence to ourselves by the rumination and the stories that we tell ourselves. And I hear you inviting us to these practices as a way to not let those stories that we tell ourselves do such damage to ourselves. And you mentioned a concept I had never heard of before. I've heard of the distinction. I talk about it a little differently, but I'd never heard the story of the second arrow. Would you share that and then kind of unpack some of that for us in thinking about maybe some of the damage that we do to ourselves and the stories that we tell ourselves about our experience?
Yeah, and this is sort of a classical story, right, from the Indian Buddhist canon, I guess. The idea is that, obviously, if you get struck by an arrow, there's going to be pain. But now if you scream at yourself for whatever it is that led to you getting struck by an arrow, that's the second arrow. And that is additional pain on top of the actual initial pain caused by the physical insult of the arrow entering your, let's say, ankle or whatever. And so there are going to be things in your life that will be painful. And the question is, how are you going to make your mind and act in ways to limit anything above and beyond that? Because let's say you can't do anything about the initial arrow, but the second arrow you might actually be able to do something about. And in particular, what are the aspects of the second arrow that are within your own control in the way that you relate to your own mind and in the way that you choose to interact with other people? So both of those, I think, are part of what we're trying to cultivate. Reduce the second arrowing we do in our lives.
You share near the end of your book the way in which your own trauma and suffering had informed your vocation with the passing of your father. But would you, if you're open to kind of narrating some of that and then how you see that you're grappling with that has formed you and the work that you're doing, if you're open to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just an interesting time that you're asking me this. We just literally a couple days ago had 40 years since that accident. And, for those of you that haven't read my book yet, my father was killed by a drunk driver in a car accident, and I was in the car accident. So I actually was the only one that was actually conscious through it. It was my entire family was in the car. And I was 13 years old. So as a child, and for anybody that's listening that's experienced a trauma, either as a child or at any point in your life, it's life-altering. And the ripples of that can continue to be lifelong. Many ways will emerge on how to address how we're going to relate to trauma in our lives. And part of what happened in my own life is that I realized that I was very interested in how I might relate differently. And knowing about the brain and being a brain scientist gave me a different window in. And the idea was that if I cannot change the past, and I can't, the events that happened, maybe there was some way I could train my mind so that at least moving forward, I could keep myself as buoyant as possible and not deplete myself out. And that sort of spirit continues in all the work I do, and actually, frankly, in the people I gravitate to work toward. So working with service members, people in the medical profession, people that are emergency services professionals, and many others who are living at that edge of things will be difficult, and we must continue to live with the aspiration of thriving in the middle of that. It very much informs the solutions that I want my research to be able to offer in the world.
Been talking to Professor Amishi Jha, professor of psychology at the University of Miami, about her national bestseller, Peak Mind. Amishi, thanks so much for your time and for your good work and your generosity with yourself today.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Amishi Jha, psychologist and author of the national bestseller, Peak Mind. Just a note that Amishi has partnered with the Department of Defense and is launching a new app called Push-Ups for the Mind, soon to be available. Will be available to all and will be free to all members of the military. If you missed a portion of this interview or would like to have access to the complete unabridged version, you can follow our podcast wherever you listen. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. And the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.